What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our must-start quarterbacks and tight ends for Week 9 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. All right, so you guys know on a weekly basis, I usually do starts and sits for every matchup of the week, but taking a little bit of a lighter approach here at the midpoint of the season to my schedule. So I've got my top 10 quarterbacks as we approach the Week 9 slate. If any of these quarterbacks are in front of the other on your roster, I would definitely go with those quarterbacks. Don't get me wrong, but I want to go over some names that you might be questioning, that you might have on your bench, or if you're struggling at the quarterback position that I think are really solid starts. So without further ado, let's hop into our must-start quarterbacks, and we'll move on to our must-start tight ends for Week 9. All right, first up, we've got Justin Fields squaring off against the Miami Dolphins. Fields comes in as your quarterback 11 so far on the season. Overall, these last 4 weeks for Justin Fields have been phenomenal. At least 17 fantasy points with a ceiling of 26 fantasy points in Week 9 against the Dallas Cowboys defense. So where Justin Fields is getting a lot of his fantasy upside is from his rushing capability. At least 47 rushing yards in the last 4 weeks with a high of 88 rushing yards. Overall, against the Cowboys defense, he had 151 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a touchdown on the ground, and 60 rushing yards. And most impressively, he did not have a turnover against the Cowboys defense. This is an even better matchup against the Dolphins, right? As we looked at Week 6 and Week 7 against Washington and New England, told you guys, man, I really like the way Justin Fields is playing. He's playing very good, especially from a fantasy football perspective. But maybe we pumped the brakes going up against the Cowboys in Week 8, and he performed extremely well. He's one of the top, if not the top, waiver priorities as we moved into Week 9, and I love him in this matchup. This is a good game script against the Miami Dolphins as we approach the week. All right, next up on the list, we've got Trevor Lawrence squaring up against the Raiders. Lawrence still comes in as your quarterback 9 overall in the season. Had a really bad performance. Had him as a sit, basically a must sit against the Denver Broncos last week. Finished with just 8.82 fantasy points, 2 interceptions, a fumble, a touchdown, 133 passing yards. But I think this week against the Raiders, we'll see a much different Trevor Lawrence. I think the Jaguars offense as a whole is going to play well in this matchup. I really like what we've seen out of Travis Etienne. I think overall Lawrence is going to turn it around. This Raiders defense has absolutely been struggling. So if you've got Lawrence on your bench, or if you're in need of a streaming option, maybe Lawrence got dropped in your league. We've got a ton of teams on bye week this week. I think Lawrence is an extremely solid start as we move into the week. All right, we've got Justin Herbert next up on the list facing the Atlanta Falcons. Herbert comes in as your quarterback 13 on the season. Before Week 8, where he was on bye week, he had 19 fantasy points against the Seattle Seahawks. I get that Herbert has struggled since the beginning point of the season. I know that Keenan Allen's more than likely going to be out in Week 9, and the way it's looking at the moment is Keenan Allen's not going to play in Week 9. We know that Mike Williams is out. Those are Herbert's 2 best offensive weapons. Josh Palmer, Carter going to have to step up. Gerald Everett's going to have to step up. And Austin Eckler is going to get a lot of dump-off passes in this game. But I wouldn't doubt Justin Herbert. The Falcons are one of the worst teams in the league against opposing quarterbacks from a fantasy perspective. And they are allowing for very, very good game scripts for overall fantasy stat lines. I mean, look at last week, PJ Walker had 20 points at the quarterback position. I think that Herbert will be just fine in this matchup. And keep in mind, the Falcons are one of the worst teams in the entire league against opposing receivers as well. So I think that these young receivers will have a chance to step up and play well. So I really do think Herbert is in line for a solid performance here in Week 9. All right, with so many teams on bye week this week, I do want to mention a couple streaming options as well. And I really think that Andy Dalton is in line for another good start, right? In Week 7, 29.5 fantasy points on Thursday Night Football against the Cardinals. Week 8, didn't play as well as I thought he would play, but he had 229 passing yards and 2 touchdowns against the Raiders. Finished with 17 fantasy points, but the run game really took over for the Saints last week. Alvin Kamara went absolutely crazy, and it wasn't really a game script where the Saints needed to throw the football. I think against the Ravens, we'll see a little bit more of a competitive game script, but the end of the day, the Ravens still rank in the bottom 20 against opposing quarterbacks. So I think that Andy Dalton is a really solid streaming option. Quarterbacks on bye this week, and Dalton's floating around. I think he's a solid fill-in as we move into week 9. I think he finishes with at least 18 fantasy points, at worst 17. So I think he's in line for a really safe floor and a pretty good ceiling overall as we move into the week. All right, last on the list, we got Captain You Like That, Kirk Cousins, coming in as your quarterback, 12 so far on the season. Had 23.4 fantasy points in week 8 against Arizona, 232 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. He did have a fumble that was lost, but overall a very solid fantasy day. Actually his best performance of the season so far. I like this matchup against his former team. I think that this is a good game script at the end of the day. I think that Taylor Heineke will actually keep this game semi-competitive between the Commanders and the Vikings. We got Cousins going up against his former team. He's played well on the season. He gets a new offensive weapon in TJ Hawkinson, but keep in mind, I don't know how active Hawkinson's going to be in his first game with the Vikings, and Washington is actually the best team in all of fantasy football against the tight end position. So I don't know if he's really going to have a big week, but regardless, I do think that this offense is in line for a good day overall, and I like Kirk Cousins as we move into week 9. All right, moving on to the tight end position. I've got my top 10 tight ends here for you guys. I think there are some really solid streaming options and some options that may be still out there on the waiver wire, especially depending on the size of your league, who are super solid starts this week. We have so many teams on bye week, so I know that the tight end position is a little bit more important here in week 9, but here are your top 10 players. These are the players that should be in your starting lineups. Kyle Pitts redeems himself, right? 16 fantasy points last week. You guys know I've been really low on Pitts, but he still comes in on the top 10. Keep an eye on Mark Andrews if he does not play. Isaiah likely is going to have a really good game, but he still deserves to make the top 10 as the moment he is questionable. TJ Hawkinson, like I mentioned earlier in the video, is very, very risky, but he's still a top 10 tight end overall in the season. Depending on your scoring format, he's a top 6 tight end overall. So he still deserves to be ranked in the top 10, especially with how many tight ends are on bye week for the week, but he's a super risky option with a new team and a very tough matchup overall. But regardless, let's hop into the must-start tight ends here in week 9. All right, first up on the list, we've got Zach Ertz, finished with 13.4 fantasy points in week 8. Really encourage you guys to continue to start him after in week 7 he had his worst fantasy performance of the season. Listen, guys, I get that this is a really easy start. Zach Ertz is still coming in as your tight end 3 overall on the season. He gets an incredible matchup with the Seahawks, one of the worst teams against the tight end position in all of the NFL. So I love Zach Ertz this week. Listen, I get that it's an easy must start, but he really comes in as my must start tight end of the week. And I've seen enough rosters out there where you guys are rostering Zach Ertz and a second tight end who you might have confidence in. I think here in week 9, Zach Ertz is as much of a smash play as we're going to get. Right, next up, we've got Evan Engram, who comes in as your tight end 10 overall on the season, coming off of his best fantasy performance in week 8 against the Denver Broncos with 15.5 fantasy points, 55 receiving yards, and his first touchdown of the year. And he gets a phenomenal matchup against the Raiders this weekend. Told you guys last week, right? Like at this point, Evan Engram deserves to be rostered in all fantasy leagues. He's still only rostered in about 63% of fantasy leagues according to the Sleeper app. You need to pick him up, especially if you need a tight end streaming option here in week 9. He's had at least 9 fantasy points in the last 4 weeks, with 3 of those 4 performances being in the double digits. He is a great play as we approach the week. All right, next up, we got Robert Tonyan of the Green Bay Packers coming in as your tight end 13 on the year. Been a little bit disappointing since week 6, where he had 19 fantasy points, but then just 6.2 against Washington, 8.5 against Buffalo. But those are pretty stout matchups overall. And this week he gets the Detroit Lions, who just allowed a really good stat line to Mike Gesicki last week. And overall, the Lions have played awful against the tight end position. Let's face it, this defense has played awful against every offensive position. The Packers are in desperate need of both a win and a strong offensive statement. I think Robert Tonyan will be a big part of this game plan. I think Robert Tonyan against the Lions is a great play, and he's only rostered in about 58% of fantasy football leagues according to the Sleeper app. He should be rostered in more leagues. He's a beautiful streaming option as we move into week 9. Next up, we've got Tyler Higbee against the Buccaneers. Higbee has really kind of fallen off the map after having, 4 straight weeks with double-digit fantasy performances and 8.9 points in the first week. Week 6, 1.7 points, a bye week in week 7, and then 3.5 fantasy points in week 8. I get that it's been very bad overall, but at the end of the day, the Buccaneers have not played well against the tight end position. We've got 2 offenses that were very good last year. We got the Super Bowl champion. We got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who looked very, very good offensively last year, both playing not so good on the season so far this year. I think this is going to be a really interesting matchup. I think that Higbee, who really acts like Matthew Stafford's security blanket, will be a big part of the offensive game plan. So especially in full PPR leagues, I think that Higbee has a good matchup. I think it's a good game script. I think that Higbee is a good start on a week where we're missing a lot of tight ends moving into week 9. All right, last on the list, we've got Hayden Hurst, who is actually rostered in about 73% of fantasy leagues. And I've really been encouraging you guys. Hayden Hurst and Evan Engram for weeks, it felt like, were on every waiver wire video, and they've just been solid throughout the year. Really, when we look at the tight end position, after those top 3 or 4 tight ends, you have to identify just some consistency. And overall on the season, Hayden Hurst has had 7.4 or more fantasy points in every matchup this year except for 2 matchups, and he's coming off a game where he had 42 receiving yards. A week before, he had 48 receiving yards. So even though he didn't have the highest fantasy stat lines in the last 2 weeks, he's still definitely involved in the Bengals passing game. With Jamar Chase going down, listen, I know that the Bengals looked awful against the Browns, but I do think that they'll bounce back here against the Panthers in week 9. It's not the best matchup, it's not the worst matchup, but I think that the Bengals are in need of a strong offensive performance. With Chase out, Hayden Hurst should naturally see some more targets. And listen, I think that the Panthers are going to keep this game competitive. The Bengals are really banged up in terms of their secondary. I think that the Panthers are actually probably going to have a pretty decent day. I think the Bengals are going to have to fight back and pass the football in this game. So I think that Hayden Hurst is just a really safe floor, a safe play as we approach week 9. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today or find it helpful, please hit that like button on the way out, and please hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And look out for our next fantasy Q&A live stream. We would love to have you guys there on a weekly basis. I usually do starts and sits for every matchup, but like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this week we're just doing must starts, taking a little bit of a lighter approach here. The midpoint of the season is taking a little bit of a mental break overall. So I hope you guys enjoyed this format for the week. Let me know what you guys thought of it overall as well in the comments down below. Make sure you guys check out all the links down below as well on the way out. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.